As much as I love sprawling, gigantic games that likely take a non-zero amount of human sacrifices to create, a more focused and smaller title can be just as good. A lot of people are critical of the modern AAA gaming industry, often calling it cooked and/or washed. And I can't disagree. It certainly feels like for the majority of high-budget games that come out these days, the studio is trying to figure out a way to make money off the players first and foremost, and then works backwards from there to create a game. But even in the dismal landscape of current day gaming, it's the indie games we can still turn to for quality. There's something innately appealing about playing a game that was created by a small group of close-knit developers, making a title not because they think it'll sell $50 million worth of microtransactions, but because they want to make a game like those that they love. Every once in a while, a certain indie game will take hold of those more plugged into the scene. Hits like Bastion, The Outer Wilds, and The Binding of Isaac are all examples of this, and we might just be now seeing the latest, with Antonblast. Antonblast, released on December 3rd, 2024, was developed and published by the indie studio Summitsphere, after a very successful Kickstarter campaign. It's a 2D platformer that will feel familiar to those who've played others in the genre, but it also manages to feel like nothing you've ever played before. In preparation for Antonblast, I played technically 4, but basically 3 games. The first of these was Wario Land 4, released in 2001 for the Game Boy Advance. If there's one game that Antonblast points to as its chief inspiration, it has to be Wario Land. The controls are similar, with the basic attack in both being a forward dash, and Antonblast heavily borrowing the timer mechanic where the player has to run back to the beginning of the level to escape. I very much enjoyed Wario Land 4. I'd been aware of it before, but now actually playing it, it's an awesome time. The Game Boy Advance went through its life missing an original 2D Mario game, but Wario Land fills that void nicely. I recommend giving it a shot if you haven't played it. But be aware! As of the time I'm recording this, Wario Land 4 is not included in the Game Boy Advance section of Nintendo Switch Online. Sorry, looks like they had to give priority to all 3 Densetsu no Starfy games. The second game I played was Pizza Tower, developed by Torta Pizza and released in 2023. Like Antonblast, it's heavily inspired by Wario Land 4, making use of similar controls and end-of-level timer mechanics. I remember seeing the buzz around Pizza Tower when it first came out, and I was interested, but it fell into being one of those games I'd get around to playing one day. But now that I've finally gotten the chance to play it, I can say, holy shit, this game is good! The levels are so creative and well designed. The controls hit that perfect sweet spot of easy to use, hard to master. The art style is original and just fascinating to look at. And the music! The soundtrack is evidently the composer's first published work, and my god, he hit it out of the park. It feels illegal for an indie game to have this great of a soundtrack, but it's real. I loved Pizza Tower, so much so that it inspired me to order a pizza. If you want to consider Pizza Tower as competition for Antonblast, it's got a pretty steep battle. The games are certainly more alike than they are different. They're both indie games that use some form of crowdfunding, they're both inspired by Wario Land 4, and they were both created in Game Maker. But Summitsphere isn't a level 1 developer, because they've already got some titles they've put out. Summitsphere's first game was Anton Ball, released in 2019, and is available for free, or with a donation, on itch.io. It was created in 8 days as part of the website's GB Jam, a game jam that asks small developers to make original Game Boy style games. It's a simple little arcade title that combines Breakout with Mario Bros. Instead of controlling a paddle, you control a guy, Anton. It's a very clever mixture of 2 classics constructed in a way I'm honestly surprised hadn't been done before. It's a pretty small game, with the only downside to it being that you have to control Anton with a keyboard. And if you've never played a 2D platformer with keyboard controls, let me tell you, I'd rather play Elden Ring with the Wii Remote. I know I can go and remap the key bindings to my controller through Steam, but why would I do that when instead I can play Anton Ball Deluxe, released in 2021 for the PC and Nintendo Switch. Anton Ball Deluxe is basically the same as Anton Ball, but deluxe. It's expanded in every way. The visuals are much improved, you can double jump and forward dash, there's additional game modes, multiplayer, and best of all, native controller support. It takes the idea that Anton Ball created and fully realizes it. It's super fun and gets pretty challenging. And considering I got it for $1.58, I'm more than satisfied. So now that we've covered Antonblast's inspiration, competition, and predecessor, let's get into the game itself. The story goes that Satan is jealous of how red Anton is, and he steals all of Anton's alcohol. Kind of an odd premise, but a unique one. And for this type of game, the story doesn't really matter anyway. Levels are accessed through the hub world, which expands as you progress. The game does a good job of making it clear where your next objective is. This is an advantage over Pizza Tower, where I found myself getting lost and unable to find the next level more than I'd like. When talking about a game, especially a brand new game, I do find it helpful to put it up next to others like it, and see what it changes and how that works out. Luckily for me, Summitsphere has posted exactly what games they're inspired by on their Kickstarter page, those being Wario Land 4, Metroid Dread, Cuphead, Crash Bandicoot 2, Shovel Knight, and Sonic CD. Now, except for Cuphead, I've played all of these games, and I can definitely see traces of them in Antonblast. Obviously, the Wario Land 4 influence is heavy, to the point where I don't think there would be an Antonblast if Wario Land 4 didn't exist. The forward dash, referred to as the clutch, is very similar to Wario's shoulder bash. Many of the transformations evoke those in Wario Land, and the entire setup of having to run back to the start of each level is very clearly a borrowed mechanic. So if you were to ask Antonblast, who's your daddy? The truest answer would be Wario Land. But the biggest similarity the game holds to Wario is also where it's the most different. Because while Wario Land will have the player largely running back through the same area they initially traversed, Antonblast will put the player through more new environments. You'll still end up back at the start, but how you get there is largely going to be different. You'll have to conquer sections you never saw initially, forcing you to run through unfamiliar territory with the pressure of a ticking clock. I won't say that Wario Land is inferior for making you go back through the same area. There's definitely something cool about getting past the same obstacles you already passed, but this time going the opposite way. But at the same time, I can't discount the benefit of going through fresh content in these sections instead. So in this aspect, neither game is better or worse than the other. They're just different. And in Antonblast's case, choosing to do something new over a more direct copy was the right move. The second game that inspired the team was Metroid Dread, which, I have to be honest, I don't see all that much of in Antonblast. Obviously they're both 2D games, but that's the end of the similarities that I see. The game's Kickstarter page says that each world is a wide-open mini Metroidvania, with half an hour or more of exploration each on first run. But I don't really think that's true. For one thing, I didn't spend much more than 20 minutes in each stage, unless I died a lot, which definitely happened. But to say that each level is its own wide-open Metroidvania, I can't agree. The levels aren't super linear, but by that I just mean that you aren't going from left to right the entire time. You'll often be moving up and down, backwards, or even into the background. But no matter what, you'll be following a designated path. The path might take you any which way, but if you stray from it, you're not going to be making much progress. There's secrets you can find, but not any more than other 2D games that don't describe themselves as Metroidvanias. The closest thing to Metroid I can think of are the crates with different playing card suits on them. Often your path will be blocked by crates with a suit painted on them in a certain color, and you have to venture to the corresponding detonator to blow them up. I suppose that if I think about what the most simple definition of a Metroidvania is, then sure, this falls into that category. You open up one route by going down another. But that doesn't really capture the spirit of what makes a Metroidvania game great. You aren't gaining an ability that sticks with you and changes the way you view your environment. You're opening one specific area by going to another specific area. But I want to be clear, I don't think it's bad that Antonblast is a linear game. Some of the best 2D platformers of all time are completely linear, so I've got no problem with that. And there's plenty that Antonblast is able to do well because it's a linear game that it couldn't if it was a Metroidvania. But if you go into this game expecting to be exploring all around, finding different ways to get to your objective, I think you'll be disappointed. Again, I haven't played Cuphead, so let's skip to the next game, Crash Bandicoot 2. Look, I know people like Cuphead, and I'll get around to playing it eventually, but in preparation for that, I'd have to watch every Mickey Mouse cartoon, so it's gonna be a while. But Crash Bandicoot 2, and really the entire Crash trilogy, is something that I can see very alive and well in Antonblast. Not so much gameplay wise, although there's definitely similarities, but more so on the overall style. If there's one game series that can perfectly sum up the colorful, wacky madness of the 90s, it's Crash Bandicoot, and Antonblast carries this torch well. The character designs and cutscene animations are both superb. It looks and feels like a Cartoon Network show from back in the day, although with a bit more alcohol and swearing. Inside the levels, the style remains, with colorful lettering popping out whenever you kill an enemy, head-banging music, loud and punchy sound effects, chunky pixel art, and an overall griminess to the visuals that I can't get enough of. I can also see a lot of inspiration from Crash's Cortex in Antonblast's Satan, which I appreciate as someone who loves larger-than-life, goofy villains. Next on Summitsphere's list of influences is Shovel Knight. And hey, look, if I was making an indie game, I'd want it to be like Shovel Knight too. A game created by a small team that had a ridiculously successful Kickstarter campaign, received fantastic reviews from critics and players, and sold millions of copies. Shovel Knight basically proved that crowdfunded indie games can work, so much so that the development team did it again for their next title. Yacht Club Games definitely didn't need the money after selling 3 million copies of Shovel Knight, but if people are going to give it to them, I don't blame them for taking it. On the gameplay front, Shovel Knight and Antonblast don't have a ton in common, aside from both being 2D platformers. But what they both do is similar. Shovel Knight took inspiration from the NES era, combining the style of classic titles with inspiration from modern ones. Their Kickstarter page even says that it may remind you of Mega Man, Castlevania, or Dark Souls. Sound familiar? Antonblast does the same, but trades the mid-80s for the late 90s and early 2000s. Rather than NES titles, it's inspired by those from the Game Boy Advance. It's cool to see new generations of young developers rise up and go on the same journey. Here we are, 11 years after the Shovel Knight Kickstarter, with the release of Antonblast, which is inspired by games that came out about 11 years after those that inspired Shovel Knight. And finally on our list of influences, we come to Sonic CD. Now, this is an interesting one. I can certainly see the influence of the original Genesis games on Antonblast. The desire to keep up a constant speed and the not completely left to right level design are something that the game clearly shares with Sonic 1 through 3. But Sonic CD? That's an odd choice to single out specifically. If they had listed any of the original trilogy, I would have understood. But Sonic CD is interesting. Probably only a small fraction of people have played it compared to Sonic 1. So why Sonic CD? It had been forever since I last played it, so in order to jog my memory, I fired it up and tried to see just what Summitsphere sees. Sonic CD isn't all that different from the original trilogy when it comes to gameplay. Move through the levels collecting rings, jump and roll into enemies, dash past the sign at the end. The time travel mechanic is unique, but there's nothing quite like it in Antonblast. The real similarity though is the music. The Sega CD brought the technology of the future, CD-ROM quality audio, into Sonic. The game has a fantastic soundtrack, and it sounds much closer to the music from the Sonic Adventure games than it does to the Genesis ones. Antonblast also has great music, and to describe it as Sonic-esque wouldn't be incorrect. The soundtrack was composed by Tony Grayson, who also happens to be the studio head of Summitsphere and the director of the game. That's pretty cool to have the guy in charge of the game also making the music for it. That's like if Hideo Kojima went from designing shipping quests in Death Stranding to grabbing a guitar and writing the score that plays when you fall down a mountain. The best way to illustrate how good music can be is by just listening to it. So now, I'm going to play a few clips of songs from Antonblast's soundtrack. If you'd like to listen to more, I'll include a link in the description to a playlist of songs uploaded by Summitsphere. Thanks for that, guys, by the way. So while I do see inspiration from these 4 games, probably 5 if I'd played Cuphead, there was a game, or really a series of games, that I could constantly feel while playing Antonblast, maybe even more so than Wario Land. That is the legendary Donkey Kong Country. Even though the visuals are pretty different, there's something about Anton's hulking form that I can't help but be reminded of Donkey Kong. Their controls are even similar, with the clutch forward dash having just as much in common with DK's roll as it does with Wario's shoulder bash. There's a lot of mechanics that Antonblast seems to borrow, especially from Donkey Kong Country Returns. There's jumping into the background of stages, the totems that fall forward, the sections that you can grip onto and climb, and the rocket power-up is incredibly similar. With all the games that Summitsphere cites as inspiration on their Kickstarter page, I'm surprised there's not a single mention of DKC Returns or any of the Donkey Kong Country games anywhere. I want to talk about another aspect of Antonblast that it doesn't so much take from any of these games I've discussed, but one thing it has in common with all of them. That's the fact that it never stops. There's never a boring part of Antonblast. It's running at 100% of the time. It's that same non-stop exciting gameplay that every game used to have back in the day. No drawn-out cutscenes, no mandatory walking segments, and hardly a loading screen in sight. The game keeps you locked in, engrossed in high-energy action to the point where the world around you begins to disappear. Let me put it this way. Have you ever been so focused on a game that once you finish a level or a match or whatever, you go, Jesus Christ, it's freezing in here? So overall, Antonblast manages to combine elements from other games into its own distinct experience. In this way, it very much is a successor to Anton Ball, which is built on the same principle. But even though there's a lot that Antonblast pulls from other games, there are some things I noticed that are unique to it that I want to call special attention to. The first being the level settings. Antonblast strays away from the standard grass level, desert level, snow level, jungle level, lava level themes that you see in way too many games. Far away. On the whole, the game uses urban environments pretty heavily, which is something I'm always asking for in games. I think there's a lot of cool things you can do using the city as a backdrop for a stage that many games just don't ever venture near. The game starts off with Boiler City, a rundown, sketchy neighborhood that Anton looks perfectly at home in, and from there, it just gets crazy. Level 5, the Big Bath, is a clever take on the pool room setting, with eerie background music and a lack of enemies to match. Level 7, Pinball Mire, is set in a muddy swamp with a ramshackle construction of pinball machines. And then level 8 is the Mad Mall, which is set in a mall. That's super cool. I've never played a platformer with a level set in a mall before. These are just some of the levels that stood out to me, but they're all great. You really don't know what to expect going into each one, which is exactly how you should feel. What's also unique about Antonblast is Anton's Corkscrew Crush, which is when he attacks mid-jump with his hammer, crashing down below and bouncing him up high. I want to note that this is the only way to consistently jump high in the game. There's no double jump or anything, so this is something you'll be using a lot. You can even string these together to bounce along as a big, hammery ball of death. I've seen plenty of games with double jumps, hover jumps, and super jumps, but never this. What I love about it is that it forces you to think about your environment more, because you'll be interacting with it more. And how does Antonblast take advantage of this? One word: destruction. A lot of the time, you won't just be smashing into the ground, you'll be smashing into all sorts of breakable stuff. Crates, walls, shipping containers, it's a smashing time. You end up playing Antonblast in an entirely different way than other platformers. It helps that many of the breakable objects will give you poker chips, which can be exchanged at the shop in the hub world for items that are actually useful, or just goofy stuff. I think that's what impresses me the most about Antonblast. Yes, it has the DNA of Wario Land, Crash Bandicoot, Shovel Knight, Sonic, and Donkey Kong in it, but at no point does it feel like I'm playing any of those games. It feels like I'm playing something entirely new and original. It feels like I'm playing Antonblast. And I want to say, I hope this game does well. It's a great game, but how am I supposed to know what will happen? You hear a lot these days about AAA studios struggling and shutting down, but that doesn't mean it isn't still harder for indie studios. For every Undertale or Stardew Valley, there's a million games that never really get the jump they need. So I don't know if Antonblast will do what the studio wants it to, but so far, it's looking pretty good. It's gotten some excellent critical reviews, overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam, and as of the time I'm recording this, it has an 1827 player peak on Steam, which I don't know if that's good or not, but it seems pretty good. I do hope and think that Summitsphere will have a bright future ahead of them and can make more games in the Antonverse. They've got a unique style that really draws you in, awesome design sensibilities, and a proven track record. I will look forward to seeing what they have cooking up next. Each of their games have been bigger than the last, so who knows? Maybe in a few years we'll be playing Anton 3D, inspired by popular GameCube games. God, that'd be awesome. Whatever Summitsphere moves on to, I'll be here for it.